Hi, this is Kevin Lindo, Athlete Coach Services Manager of PacificSport Vancouver Island. This is part of our Elevate Speaker Series. This is our fall episode number 1. We've done a bit of a change around with the topic. So tonight we're going to be talking about managing intensity training loads. But before we get started, I just want to just mention that we are in Nanaimo here, which is the unceded traditional lands of the Nanaimo First Nation. We're so lucky and fortunate to live, grow, learn, and compete in these traditional lands. So we will get started on this. I'm very, very excited to present Cole. Cole, hopefully I get your name right, Cole Czuchnicki. Did I say that right?
Czuchnicki. Yeah, it's close.
Czuchnicki,
close.
almost there.
There we go.
Okay, so yeah, I don't want to butcher your profile or anything. So I'm hoping you can tell the viewers and the audience kind of what your experience is and maybe what led you to get to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a very good place to start. Yeah, so thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. So we are going to talk about managing intensity load or training load, as I will probably use, as I will talk about it later in this presentation. So yeah, my name is Cole Czuchnicki. I am a kinesiologist working out of the Island Optimal Health and Performance Center up on Rutherford. And I also work as an online endurance training coach, working primarily with runners, a lot of ultra marathoners and kind of age group athletes, folks who are outside of the normal kind of team sporting age, but still who are competitive and want good quality service. So I came from I guess my sporting background is mainly running collegiate cross country, and I competed for 3 different schools, for George Brown, Mohawk College, and Humber College, all back in Ontario. And I did that while I was completing my undergraduate in kinesiology. And now I compete mainly as an ultramarathoner, competing primarily in the kind of 50-mile to 100-kilometer distances. And I work as a strength and conditioning coach with athletes. And so I always try to take the perspective of what I had as a collegiate athlete, and think about how we can apply that to folks who are, maybe 30, 40, 50 years old, but they're still putting in 10, 15, 20 hours a week of training. And why shouldn't they have also like a strength coach and somebody to look after their programming, and then to also do nutrition and to kind of give them a holistic training process similar to what you would find in a collegiate environment. And so to talk about intensity load or managing training loads, I just wanted to start with just a very simple, like an oversimplification of the training process. So we start with a system or a muscle or an athlete, like an individual or a team. We introduce some stress to the target. We allow for enough rest, and then with enough rest, the target can adapt to the stress and they become better in some way. So stronger, faster, they can continue for longer. And then ideally, we just repeat that over and over again. And if you were to graph it, it would just move in a nice progress up and to the right. But unfortunately, that is not what happens, because there are just things that happen in life that get in the way of our training process. And this can be anything from an unforeseen injury to life stress to lack of nutrition as a result of various things. Weather can play a role as well. And what I really want to talk about tonight is, how do we get ahead, or how do we plan for and prepare for these things which interrupt the training process, so that you can properly apply load to get a stimulus and actually become better. And if you were to take one thing away from today, my main message is that we, as coaches and as athletes, we need to have patience, because developing as an athlete, it takes time. And it's really, I tell my runners often that we're going to train for 3 months for this race, but really to see your true progress and to actually get where you want to be is really putting builds back to back, and then even years back to back. And this is why like Olympic cycles are often sometimes a good way to train by, even for runners who aren't competing at that level, to think of themselves as an athlete who's competing on like a 4 or a 5 year time frame. Because if we can be patient, then we can avoid injury, overtraining, and burnout. And these relate to kind of the three different types of stress or load that we can put on an individual. And I'd like to just share a little bit about my experience with the Canadian kind of collegiate cross country system and some of the problems I've seen with it, but and then what I've taken from that and applied to my practice. And the main thing is that the cross country season in college is quite short, that it starts very early September, and provincial championships are normally the second last week of October. So sometimes that's 8 weeks. And then nationals are 2 weeks after that. So you would get like a 10-week season often, sometimes 11 or 12, depending on how your college operates. And 10 weeks is often not long enough for us to go through an entire build with people. That when we program people to train for a marathon or even for other races, we want them to do 6 to 8 weeks just of base building before we send them off to do challenging workouts. And what happens is that just how short the season is really makes it so that we can't be patient with athletes. That some of them come in and they hadn't done any running in August or in July, but we have to get to doing workouts. We have to kind of train past where they are in the moment because we need them to be ready for racing. And what that leads to is injury, often overtraining, and often burnout. Some folks who adapt really well in September, but then by October they just didn't have the base to do it, and so they end up injured or burnt out and not performing well. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of stress today, and then kind of hopefully give you an example of how I've managed each. And then you can think of like stress and load. I'll use kind of interchangeably, or sorry, stress and intensity we'll use interchangeably. But the first is metabolic stress, and this is what you can think of as like we would think of this as how you train your energy system. So this would be specific to your sport, so aerobic or anaerobic, depending on what you're doing. Obviously, we would be training, say, a volleyball player who is attacking the net in very short bursts with long periods of rest. That would be very different than a rugby player who has to play, say, a 40-minute game, or a soccer player who's playing, say, 90 minutes. We want to be training in your specific, like specifically for your sport. But regardless of what the duration is or what we're doing, we really need to find a balance between intensity, how much you're doing, so the volume, and then also providing some intentional recovery. And so this graph over to the side, what I do with athletes often, especially when we're training for very long duration events, if you're training for, say, a 50-mile or a 100-mile race, there's no way that you're going to accumulate that much volume, say, in a single run as a training. But we could maybe accumulate it over the course of a week, or maybe we could accumulate half of it over the course of a week. And what that does is it puts us into a state of what we call functional overreaching, or a state of overreaching, at least, and we're hoping that it's functional. Functional overreaching is that we are able to, in this C over here, and in B as well, is that we allow for a larger training load, and then with recovery, we get what we call a super compensation. So then after you recover, your performance gets a huge boost because you put a lot of demand on the body. Now, this does have some dangers, because if we push too hard or for too long, then the athlete might not recover well, and their performance might even deteriorate over time. And this happens frequently, especially the more, I would say, aerobically demanding a sport is, the more likelihood that this type of training is going to happen. And if we continually overload an athlete, we can end up in what we now term relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. This used to be called the female athlete triad, which has recently been changed because we've noticed that it's not just something that affects female athletes. It's just that female athletes had the most recognizable symptoms, which is that they would have their menstrual cycle would become infrequent, their bone density would come down, they would have amenorrhea or low iron as a result. But we found that men also, when they get into overtraining, they also get low testosterone, low iron can happen as well. So, and this has to do with remaining in energy balance. So making sure that you're eating enough and eating good quality foods and the right amount of protein, and that if we're not eating enough, but we're asking a lot of the body, then we can be in an energy deficit for too long, and then this can have hormonal effects on the body. So that's some of the dangers of what can happen if we don't balance this. And really what this leads to is that we need to have specific conditioning for what you want to do, but you need to provide adequate recovery. And I hope that most athletes recognize now, or that we can grow to learn that it's really during recovery when you actually get better. You can think about this as when you finish a workout, you're not stronger or faster than when you started that workout because you're fatigued. You can't run faster after doing 10 400-meter repeats than you did at the beginning. You have to wait a day or two to recover, and then later on you might be faster. And that adaptation takes time, but more importantly, it takes time with adequate recovery. So we can look at how do we measure intensity. Volume is easy to measure. It's just time, really. But how do we measure intensity? And this is a copy of an intensity guide I have for one of my athletes, and it can become very complicated, and we can get into like paces, but there are a few easier ways that we can use to measure intensity, and this week can help us apply some of the things we're going to talk about to, say, team sport athletes, because I'm not expecting a team sport athlete to be wearing a GPS watch while they're out on the field and recording how fast they're running. But a team sport athlete might maybe wear a heart rate monitor. We could get that. Would be one way that that we could get a measure of how hard they're working. But another way that does correlate pretty closely with heart rate is just to get what we would call a rate of perceived exertion, or it just essentially your perception of how hard you're working. And there are a couple different scales that are used. One's out of 20. Another one that I prefer to use is just out of 10. So it's very simple. We can use this with children, with anybody, and you would say, hey, how hard did you feel that whole session was? And they might say, oh, I thought it was 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10. Okay, cool. And that, what the research shows is that does roughly correlate with actually how hard they would work if we would compare that to them wearing a heart rate monitor. Now, there are some slight differences. It's not 100% accurate, but what RPE also takes into account is something we'll talk about later, which is also the like psychological or the mental stress that a workout can take. But just to say, intensity measuring it can be important, and the higher in level we get, the more specific we want to get. But I'd say working with youth athletes, teaching them how to measure their intensity out of 10 is a super beneficial skill, because it teaches them kind of body awareness and just self-awareness as to how they're doing.
And Cole, sorry if I can just interject there, Cole.
Yeah, sure.
Your camera's off. I don't know if that was purposeful or.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all good. I just wondered, great stuff on measuring that intensity. Very interesting. I just wondered if you can kind of record and track the optimal intensity. How often do you want to train that in and out of the season, and how close can that be to the competition?
Yeah, so this would really depend on the sport. I would say, so how close, so like how much recovery would we need between, like, say, like a championship and intense training?
Yeah.
Normally the lag I provide is about 10 to 12 days between, say, like our last hard workout and when we would go and perform an actual like longest and go perform a race. So that would normally be about a week out, a week and a half. We would start normally a taper. That's pretty traditional in endurance sports. Um, I tell my athletes that during that last 2 weeks, so if our main event is on a Saturday, then 2 weeks out, we're still working out and we're still trying to stay within like a flow. So we're still working out on the same days. The intensity actually will stay the same, but volume of intensity and overall volume is what would come down within that last 2 weeks. And that should generally allow enough time to recover.
Mhm.
If that answers the
Yeah,
question.
thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, going back, actually, what I'd like to just talk about is that there are 6 zones identified. But if we look at this kind of down here, I'll say zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4. This is a much, I would say, more applicable way to think about using the heart rate training zones, or to using the training zones, because it's easier for us it's easier for folks to kind of feel the difference in these paces. That developing a feel for feeling 6 different intensities that are actually kind of, some of them can be relatively close together. That takes time and it takes skill. So if we're working with youth often, we want to just teach them essentially a couple different gears. So that would be like an easy gear, a middle gear, and then a hard gear. And if you can teach 3 zones that way, this would roughly correlate with up to like 50 to 80% of your heart rate, from about 80 to maybe 90% of your heart rate, and then from 90 up to your maximum heart rate. So those would be the 3 different zones we're going in. So then we can think of, okay, how much time do we want to spend in each zone? So when we look in terms of like aerobic training, the elites and the folks who do the best tend to spend the majority of their time in that first zone. So that would be like 70 to 90% of their training time in zone 1. Zone 2 training is very enticing, especially for newer athletes, because in my world, all running, when you're new, running is just hard. It just is hard. It takes time to become fit enough to actually train in zone 1, because when you first start, and for a lot of younger athletes, they just cannot control intensity. Getting them to run in zone 1 is nearly impossible because they just zoom off. So they spend a lot of time training in zone 2, but it's actually one of the unless you're training for like a marathon or a half marathon or something, one of the longer distances, it's one of the less useful zones that you get more benefit from spending time in zone 3. And this is a concept that if any coaches want to look into this, it's called polarized training. So the idea is that we spend the bulk of our time in easy training, and then when we're doing work, the work we do is quite hard. And this is, you can see this in a lot of the like elite East African athletes, and like at least elite athletes from all over the world. But when we're and so a question now is, so this is again a lot about numbers and percentages and heart rates, but if we have a team of 30 people, how can a single coach keep track of all of these training loads? And really what we want to do is to get like a model or a method so that you can get down to something down to like one number that can be easily collected at the end of a session. So what we want to do is get a good method is to get the athlete's perceived effort, and then just how much time you spent at that for like during that session. And that we can get is, and then into just one nice number. And then you can use that number to track things over time. And so we can then think about developing an annual plan, or applying this to our annual plan. And when I came out of university and started working with athletes, I think often a lot of new practitioners were very like trying to follow things by the book. And what I realized is that not many athletes actually have an annual plan. That there are lots of very high performing athletes out there who are working between, say, 2 or 3 different coaches. They might have somebody doing their strength and conditioning. They might play 2 sports relatively competitively. But there's nobody necessarily looking after, hey, how are we allowing for recovery between seasons, or where am I trying to peak? Because you can't be in peak condition at all times during the year. It's just physically impossible. So we want to elicit a peak and at the right time. So having some idea of a training, of an annual plan, so we can know, and this is a good way for an athlete. You can sit down, and if you're 12, 13, 14, sit down with your parents and have them plan. And when I make annual plans for people, again, they can get quite complicated, but an easier way to think about it is just these 4 different parts of the season. So preseason would happen before we go into training, and generally we're increasing training load. When we're in season, this is your practices are happening, the team is meeting, you're probably also playing games or having competitions at this point, and we might be continuing to increase, or we might be maintaining, and this will really depend on the length of your season. A traditional basketball season, will say, it can be quite long, or volleyball as well. So during the first half of that season, you would probably be increasing your load, but then once we get into towards peaking, we will start to maintain. And then when we get towards championship, to where however far we think we're going to make it, we would either maintain or likely actually decrease the total training load to allow for more recovery. And then when we're not playing anymore, we would want to pull back on the recovery. And similar to how you would schedule a week, you don't have hard sessions every day. We don't have hard months every month. And so we want to get into some form of a flow over the course of a year. And the more practice an athlete can get with this, the better. So, and then for weekly planning, a big thing, like my main thing for an athlete, is that we want to find whatever the most sustainable weekly routine is. And this means that we try to get them doing the same thing on Monday that they do on, like, every Monday, they do the same thing. Every Tuesday, they do the same thing. Or this can also be every other week, that we could go on a 14-day cycle instead of 7, but that totally works. But what I do for aerobic programming is I set this minimum for myself of trying to balance, for every hard workout that they have to have an easy session in between. So for some athletes, if we're training hard every day, then that leads us to now having 2 sessions a day, and sometimes that can become untenable. But then what we need to do is look at what is the purpose of every session. Is the purpose of this session to increase my aerobic or muscular fitness, or is the purpose of this session to develop more skill? And if we're practicing every day, we can kind of bounce back and forth between skill development and, say, aerobic development, and then that can do hard or easy sessions that way. So I try not to have big changes in a week, except for when I'm switching between these annual seasons, because, again, sustainability is the most important thing for me. Consistency, the plan or whatever workout routine. This is even if you're not in a sport, what's going to make you fittest is the routine that you can stick with. And then I'll increase loads between 10 and 20% very early in the build, so that can be in the preseason. But then once we get later into the build, the increases, that even if we are increasing, they will get quite small. They might only be 1 or 2% over the week before, but we can still continue to increase and then eventually decrease. So okay, so hopefully I'm not going too long, but here's an example. So I get a lot of folks who come to me as I would say rehabilitated triathletes, and triathletes are chronically, as a group, overtrained, because they are training 3 different sports all the time, and they will often have a swim coach and a cycling coach and a running coach, and they want to do some strength and conditioning. And a lot of the folks I deal with also have full-time jobs. So Veronica here, she came to me, she was competing. Again, she had 3 different coaches. I ended up being the third, and then had a ton of natural talent, really wanted to compete, no real injury history. But what would happen is she would just become overtrained, and her race performances as a result and her training was just super inconsistent, that she couldn't figure out like why she would bounce back and forth from like burning out, taking time off for a bit, coming back, being super strong because she would take time to recover, but then overtraining again. And what this led to was just a huge frustration with making any actual progress, because when it counted, she couldn't count on herself to actually perform. And she actually ended up like almost quitting all of these sports. So the solution that we took was just to was with an initial bout of rest to fully reset. And we assessed to make sure her gait and everything, like her body was still moving fine. So we didn't need to do any rehab in that way, but what we needed to rehab was her training system and her weekly scheduling. So there ended up being some nutrition counseling that needed to be done, because she was heading into this reds, and she was like out of energy balance. And then we set up a system so that she could monitor her stress between sessions and also over the course of a week. And when we found a balance between work and recovery, and we made very logical small steps each week. And what we ended up doing was actually probably about 60 or 70% of the volume that she was previously doing, but she ended up improving. And it just kind of really goes to show you that sometimes more isn't better, and that we needed to be patient and to allow her fitness to develop. Okay, so that's hopefully the biggest one. That's when a lot of people think about managing load. That's often what we think about is aerobic stress, because that is really what's measured inside of the literature. But the other types of stress to really think about are like mechanical and psychological, which we're going to go over. So mechanical stress is just literally the stress that's put on your muscles, joints, on your bones. And the example of this is that if you have a torn ACL, it doesn't matter how fit your heart and lungs are, you're not going to be able to complete a full soccer game. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the rest of your body can tolerate the stress or the load that is placed on it. And a good tidbit to remember is that the most injuries are actually caused well before we notice them, or at least a lot of them. That the result from overtraining, which can have to do with being out of metabolic balance, like we were just talking about, just lack of recovery. And then one of two things will happen: that we'll have like an initial tweak that often will become ignored. This can be, for in my line of work, this is often folks will go out and they'll roll their ankle, and they'll be like, they'll like walk it off. They're like, it's totally fine. And then they continue to run on it. And then they run on it for another few weeks. And if they were to pay attention to it and do some of the things I'm going to mention, they would notice that the area hasn't fully healed, but they're kind of sore generally from training anyway, so they don't really notice it. And then they go to do something which they normally could do, like say jump over a log, and then they land on their ankle, but their ankle isn't prepared for it, and then they actually like they could break or actually tear something within their ankle, and then the injury becomes worse. The other way that this happens is just gradual onset of, say, overuse, that nothing really big happened, but that we're not checking in with our body, and there is a general like too much stress being applied to one area. We're unaware of this development happening because we're not checking in, and then again that area is stressed, it's overworked, but we haven't noticed, and something we could normally do actually injures us. So this is an example we'll go over. So I had another athlete who had just chronic like reoccurring plantar fasciitis. So they would heal with treatment and rest, it would be totally fine. They would start training again, and then because they were training again and everything was feeling good, they would stop doing their rehabilitation exercises. And those rehabilitation exercises had been allowing them to check in with what was happening with their muscles and with the area. And because they weren't doing them, they became unaware of what was happening. The injury would slowly creep up. Again, they were just generally sore from training. And then the injury all of a sudden would flare up one day after something that they would normally do. It'd normally be like they go for a 5K run when they could normally run 20, and they'd be like, I don't know what happened. And they would have these constant layoffs, and again, frustration with lack of progress. So we took a look at we first, again, allowed for rest, a little bit of treatment, and got them back to a point where they could run. We assessed their weekly mileage and like the demands that they were putting on, and they were making logical steps. So it wasn't that they were out of step and they were putting too much stress metabolically or aerobically. It was just that the actual structure within their foot couldn't handle what was going on. So what we implemented was a weekly exploratory. So SMR stands for self myofascial release. It's a fancy way of saying foam rolling. So we did foam rolling because foam rolling can be beneficial for this type of injury, but also because what foam rolling does is it allows you to feel if you have tissue that's injured. If you have a damaged calf and you foam roll it, you'll notice. And what we would do is we would set a scale of 1 to 10. How painful will we allow your calf to be? Okay, if it's 3 out of 10, then maybe that's the danger zone. 2 out of 10 maybe is acceptable. If it gets to a 4, then you have to start pulling back on your mileage. And because we were doing this every week, we would do this session specifically to analyze how the tissue was tolerating the training load. We were able to moderate how much training they were doing, and then to implement exercises before an injury presented. And then that allowed for us to kind of continue with training. And the plantar fascia still flares up slightly, but it doesn't take us out of training. And again, this allows us to be patient and to allow training to happen. And that is all wrapped up in what I'm going to get to at the end, which is a kind of a personalized warm-up, which is the main thing. And then the last type of stress I'll talk about, which I think is often neglected. Kevin, am I going too fast, or is this an okay pace?
No, it's fine. I have a couple questions.
Sure. This is a great time for questions on any of these.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the metabolic stress.
Sure.
Is a lack of performing the main factor or the only factor when recognizing that?
No. So that is one of the, actually this study here, this one down on the bottom, it's actually what it looks at is, because often we'll see like a lack of performance is just a very noticeable factor, but there are some other things which you can look at. So changes in mood generally, folks might become slightly more irritable. They could be like symptoms that would mimic depression or anxiety might start to present. Lack of appetite will be another one, which then again plays into this being in an energy deficit. Also lack of sleep, or like an inability to stay asleep or to get to sleep. So changes in your sleep patterns, those can all happen as well. And these are all things which we can look for. And when I get into the personal warm up, I'll kind of hopefully we'll get like that. I'm talking about a lot of things. There's a lot of numbers here, but I'm trying to, at the end, hopefully we'll be able to get like a framework, something very like relatively simple that we can do to like look at all of these factors, because a lot of these factors become neglected. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And that's interesting, because coming from a coach's lens, it's really important that we can look for that, and we should be looking for that almost as a duty of care. And the last one I had regarding this kind of part of the presentation was checking in. So you hear that a lot, people saying, have you checked in with yourself? Listen to your body. How do you treat that check-in? Are you looking for RMT? Are you looking for icing and heating? What types of things come with that checking in process?
Yeah, do you know what? That will why don't I go through this psychological part right now?
Sure. Fine, no worries.
And then do you know what? Yeah, and then that will 100% hopefully be answered in this personal warm-up. So what I do is I address check-ins previous to every workout with my athletes. So, or at least I request of them to check in some way.
Right.
So, and that we would be checking in for each of these 3 different types of stress. So for metabolic stress, we'd be looking for those signs of overtraining. So you would check in with yourself and you would just give yourself a scale of 1 to 10. How has my nutrition been? How has my sleep been? Cool. If we're staying on top of those, then great. I also, in my training logs with people, I ask them to give an RPE, but another rating I'll get people to give is a happiness rating with how happy they are with an effort,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a big difference between going out for a 5K run that say it feels quite hard, and then you're like, oh yeah, I crushed that run, I did so good, like I really pushed, right? That's a great feeling. You could be 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 on that. But then you could go out for the same run, and it feels hard, but it was supposed to be an easy run, right? The heart rate's in the same place, the pace was the same, but you weren't supposed to be running hard, and you in fact weren't trying to run hard. You were trying to run easy, but your body just kind of wouldn't let you. Everything felt hard that day, and so you might not feel great about that run, and or feel great about the workout. So um yeah, figuring out like there's a lot of different things we can measure, but figuring out like what is the best way to communicate with your athletes. So maybe like perceived exertion isn't the best one to do. I mean, I think it is quite good, I would do it anyway. But maybe getting a happiness, okay, how do you feel you performed during that workout, right?
Mm-hmm.
During that practice, do you feel like you achieved what you were trying to achieve from that?
Mm-hmm.
And that might require, I would say, probably more maturity. I wouldn't necessarily ask that question of like a 10-year-old, right? but
Yeah.
but I would ask that question of an 18-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And if they couldn't answer, I would start being like, okay, like if you want to play at this level, then this is the type of thing you need to know, because they should understand the intention of a session.
Right.
They should understand what they're trying to do personally, because again, a coach, like you have to rely on the athlete to have a certain amount of self-direction and autonomy, right? So
I think that's a great message, because myself coaching in the community, that's a constant question I'm asking. Yes, do a supplementary workout program, but when are you doing it and why are you doing it?
right.
That's the questions I ask. And I'm not a sports scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I would be leaning on those folks like yourself to try and educate if you're with those athletes. So, because as you probably know, they get thrown into these gym programs and additional programs. But what is the intention there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I do, like my work. So I work as a strength and conditioning coach as well, but the facility that I have, we're not set up to have huge teams. So I work with individual athletes. And what I do, if somebody comes and works with me, is I take responsibility for their warm up and for their cool down.
Mm-hmm.
And because I find that most coaches are okay with being like, okay, you have a personal warm up. Okay, so long as you're doing the workout, that's really what's important. If the person's like, my kinesiologist told me I have to warm up my hip this way, then that's normally acceptable. I'm not stepping on anybody's toes, but it allows me to fill in these holes of checking in with all these different systems. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and so this last type of stress, which I think again is often super neglected, is the psychological stress. So again, some things we should just kind of know so that we can understand the skills we're trying to develop here, which is that there's a difference for a lot of sports, finding a balance between focus and relaxation, that those can be two different things. We'll often tell people that we want to get them into a flow state, but that's like it's very challenging to do, and then B, is it optimal, and like, are you going to be able to stay in that flow state? If you're in a sport that say has repeated 30-second plays, right? Like if you're constantly being distracted. And then what I would say, and this is what I work with my endurance athletes, and what I think is can be really applicable to team athletes and especially to younger athletes, is to developing skills so that we can maintain an ideal level of arousal. So this is the idea. This is the inverted U theory here, and the idea is that if I were to wake you up and get you out of bed and ask you to run a 400-meter at peak effort, there's no way you would be able to do it, because you would like, I just rolled out of bed. I need to wake up, right? So if we're not awake enough, if we're not stimulated enough, then we can't perform. And then if we stimulate you a little bit more, your performance will increase, and that there will come a point where you're stimulated enough to have your optimal level of performance. And that's where we want to have athletes. Now, what's important to note is that that how stimulated an athlete is very personal. And that what will happen is this looks like a nice bell curve, but this might be shifted to the left or shifted to the right depending on the athlete. And what often happens is, again, it's depicted as a nice bell curve, but what I find with a lot of athletes is that it should actually probably be a shallower slope on the left. So arousal happens, or like stimulation happens slower. But then when we get into being too stimulated, often athletes will kind of just fall off a cliff. And that will very quickly move from feeling ready to feeling stressed to feeling anxious and then to panicking. And so what we do is we often wait for performances to happen, for events to happen, and then try to deal with this in those moments. But what we should be doing is developing the skill of stimulation control every session, and it can be relatively simple to do. Um, so I'm actually going to use myself as an example here, because this is my experience as a collegiate athlete. Is that I have a clinical general anxiety disorder and major depressive disorders, and I have like mental health concerns which play a role on my performance within my sport. And as anyone who has tried to do any type of running race knows, it's a largely mental sport, because you're just really competing against yourself. Nobody else can stop you from running faster. Um, and I would very easily go off the right side of this curve. So I would become very, very fit, but then all sorts of different stresses would get in the way for me. I would perform really well during training, but then races would often throw me into just a hyper stimulated state. And this was especially early in my cross country career. And then I became very frustrated again with my lack of progress, because I was doing all this training, but I could never race better. So I did this to myself. I took a look at like what I was doing. Am I overtraining? I was probably in an okay spot. I worked with a nutritionist to get everything back in line. I assessed to make sure, yeah, my body is cooperating. My musculoskeletal system is great. But what I did is I personalized my warm up. And what I did with this is that I realized that all of the other runners on the other teams were like being very hyper personal, and that almost like there was like almost an animosity between all the runners when we were like warming up and preparing. People would look at each other and like maybe nod if you knew somebody. And what I realized made me feel better, and what kept me from becoming too stimulated, was actually just to like joke around with people and to smile and to try to have as much fun as I could. And I would try to carry that as long as I could up until the race. And so we would even get on the line to race, and I would always like, there would be that moment right before they shoot the gun, and I would turn to the teams beside me. I'd be like, hey man, good luck, I hope you have a great race. Just, and I try to be friendly and like try to not just to like get rid of some of that like animosity that I felt bubbling up, because it made me too anxious. And what happened is I actually ended up winning a sportsmanship award for like being nice to the other teams, but it was really just me trying to control my own anxiety. And then other skills, which I'll talk about in a sec, were like visualization became really, really huge. So okay, so those are all the types of stress, and really what that can become a lot. Like a coach or an athlete could look at that and be like, man, that's a lot. How do I do that for every athlete, especially if I'm doing like if I'm trying to train 30 people at a time? So what I like to do is to take control of a personalized warm up and cool down. So there are a couple factors we want to, or a couple pieces we want to put together, and then at the bottom it says like, is there a best order? I'm not too sure. There's an order I like, but really I don't think the order plays as big of a role as just making sure that we're paying attention to all of these, so again we can check in with our athletes or with ourselves. So first part of warm up is that we want to do some form of thermal. You just need to actually heat your body up. On cold days you need to do more of this. On hot days you don't need to do as much. If you were to stand in a sauna, it would likely do a very similar thing. Often we just do an easy jog. This is pretty ubiquitous in a lot of sports. So I would say the next part we would do is assess injury development. So this is where, again, I use foam rolling to just roll out whatever tissue that athlete specifically has injured in the past. So we always want to know that that athlete's like, okay, if you've rolled your ankle before, you have to pay particular attention to your calves and your ankles and your feet just for the rest of time. And it doesn't have to be that it overwhelms you, but before you go out and you ask your body to perform, you need to spend a minute and do that. And that what coaches can do is to provide this space within the warm up to allow them to assess what is happening. And if something is hyperactive, which normally you'd get like a trigger point or you'd have like a bit of pain, then to spend some time, some extra time on that tissue to allow it to relax. The other thing we would maybe do is activate weak or lazy tissue. That would be done with specific exercises. So this is actually where I put any of those physio or chiropractic exercises or progressions of them. And I put them here because I don't like making workouts of them because they are super boring. And athletes don't like doing them past when their injury feels good because they're boring. That's just it kind of sucks, but it's just the reality of it is that clamshells are not a fun exercise to do. But do we need to stimulate your glute medius before you go out and run? Yeah, maybe that might be a good idea. So doing even a single set of these exercises and then doing it regularly can mean that you don't have to make an entire other session, and we can kind of free up more time later on too. We want to wake up your nervous system. So this is doing something at a slightly higher intensity. So slams, jumps, doing some form of a stride or an acceleration. Those are all great ways of kind of starting to put things together. And then the last thing is to practice some form of arousal control. So mindfulness and breathing. And I find that I can fit almost all of this into 15 to 20 minute warm up, and that we can do this. And then what this also does is it means you practice this, and then you practice the exact same thing when you go out to do your sport, to go to your competition or your race. And then nothing is new, everything is familiar, and you're in complete control of what you want to do. So I just have a couple examples. I won't go through absolutely every detail here, but this is, say, a rugby player who is post rehab. We would want to spend about 5 minutes foam rolling. That's about 30 seconds per lower body muscle group and your lats, and maybe 30 seconds on any additional, what I would call a hot spot. We would get them to do some form. These are kind of two exercises we would classically give to somebody with a knee injury, just to make sure that they're still getting their knee through deep flexion and that we're engaging the muscles that control their knee so it doesn't move too far into valgus. I put a little dash here because if I was a rugby athlete, I would be doing this. I would be doing this inside probably before I go out to team practice. And that can be simply 5 to 8 minutes of doing some exercises before you go out. But now you've done all your rehab. You don't have to do a whole other session. And also you've done your rehab optimally because it will prepare you for what you're about to do. We would then go out, do like a nice easy jog with the team. And then this is where I would ask that coaches allow for 2 minutes in their warm up for athletes to do deep breathing and some form of visualization. That as a coach, what I do with my athletes is I tell them what the purpose of every session is. And I say, this is where the workout's going to get hard. We're doing 6 repeats, and at repeat 4, it's going to get hard. So right now, put yourself there. Visualize what you're going to do when the workout gets hard at rep 4. What type of runner do you want to be? Do you want to be the runner that starts to lag behind? Do you want to be the type of runner that acknowledges that things are hard? You're happy about it being hard because it means you're going to get fitter, and I'm going to start to push through this. Great. And you visualize yourself making the decision you want to make. We spend 2 minutes doing that before the workout. And then when you're done that, you can assess your readiness. You can say, okay, how mentally ready am I to actually perform? And be honest with yourself, because there are a lot of workouts I'd done, especially when I was in college and I was burnt out and tired. I would have given myself a 6, but I still went out and did them. And maybe what I should have done is to pull back and just do half the workout, because it would have allowed me more time to recover, and I probably would have performed better over the course of the season, right? And then you do some form of team drills. And then for cool down, just rate the session, multiply by the minutes. You get this intensity load number of 520 for this athlete. Now, that is kind of an arbitrary number, but you can, so long as you're being consistent with how you're tracking it as a coach or an athlete, then you can compare back to previous weeks and to previous sessions. I would rate how much sleep and nutrition we've got. So, and then what I would say is the coach, or if you're coaching yourself, that the job would be to maybe compare that number just to previous sessions. we can go over to kind of what I would do for a youth team. You can simplify this. So we can just do a group 5-minute easy jog, 5 minutes of foam rolling. I would do with youth teams, I would have that be guided by a coach, because foam rolling is often, they just, they will, youth will be more likely to get distracted. So just guiding and being like, okay, time to switch to the next muscle, and then you can keep them moving along. You can do whatever team drills that you're already doing for warm up. I would do 2 accelerations again to stimulate the nervous system, and then again finish with that, with the breathing and the visualization. And the only difference here is with a youth team is I would just have the coach kind of guide it, uh, just to ask them to put themselves in a specific place, or to uh, have them ask questions of themselves, or to just even count out how they can breathe. Because if we can develop this skill, then later on when you ask them to do it in a game, if they are freaking out, if they are having a hard time, they have to go make a free throw, and they, they're nervous about it, you can ask, they have already developed the skill, they can come back to the breathing, you can tell them to close their eyes, and they can wait 20 seconds, and they can hopefully get everything under control. And then with a team, what I would do, the only thing different is maybe I would just collect those numbers, I would average them out over the course of the team, and then I would also look for outliers. So is there an athlete you have who's like working way harder than they should be in that session, or way harder than everybody else is? Does that correlate with what you saw in the practice? Maybe, maybe not, right? Or is there somebody who's like, not that they rated it as a 2, and like maybe they're just a little bored and understimulated, and they could handle a little bit more, and then that can kind of show you who you should, or like could rely on for doing a little bit more work. So and I think that is my last slide. There's a lot of talking, but
That was great, Cole. I just wondered on that last couple of sides.
yeah, sure.
I really like the way you accumulating that to get that number. Does that help you with benchmarks and benchmarking through the season?
Yeah. So I would say that that's, for me, this gives me, especially when I have like newer athletes who come on. I'd say the first time you train anybody, like most coaches would realize, if you've trained somebody for multiple seasons, you get a much better sense of what they can handle. But when you onboard, if you're onboarding new athletes every year, this can give you a really good idea of like, okay, like how hard should they be working at this point in the year, and how, and where do I want to see that, that progress go. And then you can also recognize, okay, like and that should just give you, again, like the information you need to be like, is this person maybe pushing too hard? Or are they struggling? Like where should they be? And especially in running, a lot of people are also often super curious, like how fast do you think I can go? Like, okay, yeah, but how fast do you think I'm going to race? Then I could look back at previous seasons with other athletes and say, okay, well, this other person was training at roughly the same paces or roughly the same load, or like it gives me this, I can say, and you know what, you're on a similar trajectory, and this is roughly where they were. So yeah, it gives me some good benchmarks that way.
Similar to sleep and nutrition, is there any way that you track that, or you just do it kind of informally with the athletes? Because I know a lot of grassroots coaches, we probably tear our hair out, with lifestyle habits that maybe some of us and some of our athletes are choosing. So how can we gauge that, and how can we inform them without, almost having a dictatorship over them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'll use a bit of an analogy. When I was working more as a personal trainer, I would have folks come and just with whatever goal they would come with. They would say, I want to lose weight, or I want to get stronger. And I would always ask them, like, how important is this, or how committed are you to making this change in your life? And nearly everybody would tell me 10 out of 10, right? And I would say, okay, cool, that's great, I'm really glad to hear that. I'm going to explain to you what 10 out of 10 means to me. What 10 out of 10 means to me is you are LeBron James. You are like training twice a day. You have a probably dedicated rehab specialist. You have a nutritionist. You probably have somebody even cooking your meals. You have somebody like, that's what 10 out of 10 looks like. And they're like, oh, okay, I'm not there. Maybe I'm a 6 or a 7. I'm like, okay, great. That's much more realistic. And also, so what I do with nutrition and sleep is I would do a very similar thing. I would say, okay, like just rate your nutrition on a scale of 1 to 10, how good have you been? And if somebody's like, I'm the 10, like, okay, let me tell you what 10 looks like. And I would explain essentially the perfect diet for that sport, the perfect adherence to the perfect diet, and also they're enjoying it. And then normally people will give me a more realistic number, and then I'm like, okay, great, so what can we do? I'm not expecting anyone to get to 10 really on sleep or nutrition really ever. What I'm expecting is them to have an understanding of what they could be doing, because everyone can always do something better. But I'm like, okay, what could we do to move you from a 6 to a 7, right? And that they're understanding the same way as like when I send runners out, if their average running pace is a 5-minute kilometer, we're not expecting them to run at a 3-minute kilometer. We're expecting them to run at a 5, and then maybe a 4:50, right? We're expecting them to make small progress over time, because again, it's more sustainable. So I would just keep it to, I would explain to the group what a 10 out of 10 means for nutrition and for sleep, and then I would get them to self-assess, and then you can just come down to one number, right? And then and again, I mean, if somebody is really struggling, then it might require like them doing like a diary, or for you digging in deeper, but then at least it gives them like targets to aim for, and some way to assess where they're at.
Yeah, and I've noticed some of the tweaks that you've made to the training, the warm-up specifically. Has that come from your experience with mental health challenges and the steps that you took as an athlete?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably where it came from. And I would just say also, just with athletes who I found would just, I mean, runners are traditionally A types. We like are very like, we want to rush things. So I think spending a bit more time with the warm up, and even with my like strength clients, often we start the first month is often literally just, we'll spend 40 minutes just doing warm up, because they're just like, this is really what you can master. If I can get you to like take one thing away, we can do this, and then we will add workouts on top of that and start to get in. But yeah, I'd say like, yeah, a large part, like I try to blend what I've learned in school with what has also worked for me and worked for the people I've worked with, right?
And from a coach's perspective, how do you ascertain, if you haven't got all the tools or resources at your fingertips, how do you ascertain whether your athletes are suffering burnout? Is it triggered by certain type of injuries, and if so, what injuries are they?
Yeah, so what injuries? Um, yeah, I mean, so burnout for me, I look more to like the lifestyle and the other factors for burnout. If I see, my first thought when I see an actual like musculoskeletal injury is more that like too much mechanical stress. That's where I go to first. But that's, I would say, because I try to do a pretty diligent job of making sure that we're managing the other loads, right?
Mhm.
So if we're not looking at the other loads, then yeah, like overtraining can for sure lead to an injury. I would say like bursas tend to be pretty like prone to overtraining, low leg injuries as well. So that's like shin splints are super common for runners, right? Very common
Yeah.
like early on. Plantar fasciitis as well. Um, Something like a knee injury, like an actual like ACL tear or something like that's less about burnout to me. That's more about, you were probably, excuse me, flexed at the knee and took a bad twist. That's right. So
Do you?
uh
Sorry, go on.
no.
I was just going to mention, I've got lots of questions on this. I'm a bit of a, I'm trying to learn more about this as I get older. Are you screening athletes at certain stages of the year, screening and also physiological testing as well?
Yeah, so the athletes I work with, we don't do like VO2 max tests and lactate thresholds. We will do I base most of my run like my pace zoning just on a 5K time trial. That works best for me. I find we do that once or twice throughout a season. And then, yeah, I would like benchmark and do screening often for athletes, like when we first start for sure. And then normally at the start of each build. So that in a build often will last roughly 3 months. We would then do probably a month of down season, depending. Sometimes we end up shoving a couple builds together if they say want to string a couple races together. But then we would have a down period I would do gait analysis for
Right.
my folks. So we would actually like video them, see how they're running. And then we try to make like changes in form often are better. We want those to happen in the preseason or in the off season. And then when we get into season, we don't want to be tweaking the way somebody's moving because we want them to be confident and familiar with the way they move. So we're not really doing as much tweaking and benchmarking, all that stuff in season. Realistically, in season, especially at a high level, and especially when we get towards peaking, we're just trying to hold the wheels on because the athletes probably like had a lot of demand placed on them. Practices are happening. There's like they're competing quite a bit. They're pushing pretty hard. The season, especially if the season is quite long, like that stress is starting to pile up. So we're really like as a strength coach or as a kin, we would be really just pulling back and just being like, hey, we need to just do as much rehabilitative work as we can, build them up in the off season and the preseason so they can handle that stress, do all that benchmarking, all that stuff early. And then in season, I kind of hand them to the sport coach. I'm like, okay, this is the best athlete I can make. Or I give them to myself as a sport coach. And then again, hopefully we can try to manage it that way. So
do you see many other athletes from other sports coming in and getting gait analysis tests? And if so, do you see how long is it to get them to adapt or make changes in their stride?
yeah, so I've had I've had a few, a couple like a couple rugby players, soccer player, and a basketball player this past summer. So it takes for sure to understand gait. A big part of gait I try to get folks to understand is the difference between endurance running form and then sprint running form, and that could be a whole talk in itself. But they are different. That there's essentially like acceleration, max speed for sprinting, and then endurance form, which is slightly different. And that so getting my first goal for athletes is to understand the form that they need, and often just to try to understand all three of those because they do all three at different points. And that I would say would take, how long would that take? At least a month. I would say you would need probably 6 sessions would be enough for us to like 6 hours would be enough for them to get familiar with the patterns. For like actual gait retraining, what we do often is the protocol is actually only 2 weeks long, but that
Right.
ideally, and what the research shows is best, is that you would do 3 or 4 sessions a week packed into those 4 weeks, and it's that repeated process of giving certain types of reinforcement or cueing. You would, yeah, and then we would. There's essentially a process we go through, which that's yeah. So, I mean, I believe if there's running in your sport, you should at some point have your gait looked at because it's one of the most repetitive motions you do. Again, in 2 weeks, there was a really good study out of China that showed that gait retraining. They did 8 sessions over 2 weeks. They were only half an hour long, so 4 hours of training, and it had like a 65% reduction in running related injuries a year later.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah. And so a big part of this is actually pretty related to this warm up is that what I did for my undergrad is I looked at all the different forms of gait retraining and tried to be like, okay, what are the key factors that, or the similar factors, because we can be like, give you a metronome to run to, or I can give a screen with a video, or I can give you a little scale, or I could just tell you something like what's the best thing. And really at the end of the day, what's most important is having an athlete propriocept, so feel where their body is, to understand what the motion they're trying to do feels like, and then to give them opportunities to reinforce that. So again, this becomes reinforced in my warm-up for my athletes who are doing gait retraining. The exercises and drills they're doing become personal to what they're trying to do. So if hip flexion is what they need to work on, we have a hip flexion exercise they do before they go running. So then that's queued up. That helps them feel it. And then when they go to run, they can more acutely do that. And I find that it really helps an athlete apply it to the skill, as opposed to doing, say, an hour or 45 minutes of strength and conditioning like on a Wednesday and hoping that on Thursday it's still going to be in your head, right?
Yeah, and as a coach, that's the questions I would be asking mostly, like how quick and how effective is it going to be functional? And is age a big factor within the retraining?
Oh, well, I mean, like kids learn patterns quicker for sure. But I would, yeah, I would that there is, yes, is probably the answer to that question. But it's likely, I would say 55, late 50s, 60s might be when we would start to see like that the patterns, at least in my experience, the patterns start to become at least a little harder to learn.
Yeah.
So
I've got some time on my hands. That's good.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's like, I mean, we all do, and it's not that folks who are like over 50 can't do it. It's just it takes longer. That's it.
For sure.
So,
well, we're at the top of the hour right now, and I could go on all night, ask more questions, but I don't want to keep it too long. It's been great to listen to your presentation. Very interesting and great detail. I really appreciate it, Cole.
yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm happy to do it, and folks can always get a hold of me. I think my contact information's at the front of the presentation. They can rewind if they like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So Cole is out of Ireland Optimal. The Ireland Optimal team are going to be with us for this fall. Our next one's in a couple of weeks next month when we'll take on another topic, another fun presenter, and then later in the winter we're going to wrap it all up by getting a bit of a panel on. So super excited about this. If you want to learn more about something Cole mentioned, the yearly training plans for coaches, the NCCP have some performance planning and basic training planning modules that are super interesting to give you kind of base knowledge and even take you on to some high performance levels as well. So if you're interested in that, you can shoot me an email. All my contact details are on the PacificSportVI.com website. Kevin Lindor, klindor@PacificSport.com. And we will wrap it up there. So Cole, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too.
Yep. Okay. Take it easy. Thanks, everybody.
Yes. Take care.